let the melting pot go. A Zen story of radical acceptance. Right now, there is a tight, hypervigilant gripping in the joints of your fingers and a rigid defensive contraction along the entire length of your jawline. A silent internal resistance that patterns itself into your body whenever you trace the invisible numbers of the clock or notice a shift in your physical vitality. You might feel a heavy panic warming the back of your neck as you mentally tally the years, checking your reflection for changes, mourning the ease of an earlier season, and treating the natural movement of time as a quiet indictment of your worth. It is an exhausting, private war to wage in the dark. This feeling that your physical form is a fraying ledger that you must somehow preserve against the dampness of the world. Around you, the air is settling into a dry, gentle warmth, carrying the rich, sweet scent of honeycombs and heated beeswax from a nearby workspace. The low, steady crackle of a small charcoal heater inside the hearth anchors the room, while a soft, thick weave of unbleached flax cloth weights your resting limbs, creating a secure sanctuary far removed from the cold wind rustling the pine needles outside. You are not an endangered vessel because the seasons are moving across your skin, nor does the changing rhythm of your energy mean you are losing your place in the fabric of things. The natural softening of your strength is only the earth reclaiming its pattern, and tonight, no one is demanding that you seal your current form in stone to prove your right to exist. We are not here to force an artificial return to an older chapter, or to promise that the clock can be permanently jammed in place by sheer will instead. We are simply going to let the physical frame rest exactly as it finds itself, allowing the heavy wax layers of your protection to sit unworked in the dark, without requiring a single seal to be smoothed before your consciousness drops into the stillness. There is a striking paradox in the way we handle our fear of transition. The intellect continuously insists that if we can just apply enough preservation, if we can just monitor every shift and shield our appearance from the weather, we will finally secure a permanent state of safety and peace. We believe that by coating our lives in a thick, unyielding glaze, we can keep the changing world from breaking our structure apart. But the ancient insights of the Buddha reveal a much quieter, liberating truth. True stability is never found by trying to freeze a moving current, because the frantic effort to hold back the seasons always splits the very paper we are trying to protect. When you treat impermanence as a thief, you are not saving the ledger. You are merely rendering its pages too heavy and brittle to turn. The suffering you feel tonight is not born from the passage of time itself, but from the exhausting mental labor of trying to coat a fluid life in a layer of permanent wax. Think of how a raw sheet of mulberry paper rests before it is ever touched by the brush or the melting pot. It is light, porous, and perfectly content to absorb the dimming light of the afternoon, its uneven edges holding an organic dignity that requires no artificial smoothing to be complete. Every time you scan the mirror for a line out of shame, every time you treat a lower level of energy as a personal failure, it is as if you are pouring boiling, heavy wax over a delicate fiber. You stiffen the natural movement, creating a hard casing that chokes the breath out of your chest and keeps your temples throbbing against the fabric through the midnight hours. For months, you have been balancing this dense, protective shield on your brow, wondering why your breathing feels so shallow by midnight, wondering why your jaw cannot seem to unlatch its grip within the quiet room. Maybe you have felt this specific distress during an ordinary afternoon, where a sudden glance at an old photograph or a brief moment of physical fatigue dropped your stomach into a cold, hollow panic that felt completely isolating in its urgency. You might have noticed it during a busy morning, where you found yourself moving at a frantic pace to prove you haven't lost your edge, while secretly replaying past days of peak performance, checking your current self against an old blueprint. It is an immense burden to perform unchanging vigor while your internal awareness is terrified of decline. It drains the baseline warmth straight out of the core, leaving you with a brittle, fragile sensation in the center of the abdomen, even when you have kept your outward expressions entirely poised for the world around you. In a short while, we will listen to a story from an open library veranda where the golden light of autumn meets the deep shadows of the forest, showing us a completely different way to rest within our changing frames. But before we step onto that quiet wood, let this immediate space become entirely free of the clock. The heavy bronze melting pots of your anxiety can be set aside on the cold stone floor. The intellectual search does not need to audit a single gray hair or measure a single shift in your strength. You do not have to solve the mystery of aging before you close your eyes, nor do you need to calculate how you will outrun the years tomorrow. The entire fluid reality of your transitioning form can simply rest across the pillow, unpolished, unsealed, and completely safe from inspection. Let your attention sink heavily into the physical presence of the ground beneath you. Notice the exact places where the back of the head, the shoulder joints, the lower hip, and the heels meet the firm support below. Every one of these contact points is being fully carried by the earth, without you needing to offer a single day of youthful achievement to earn its stability. You do not need to play the role of the person who never gets tired tonight. You do not need to be the invulnerable anchor, the unchanging facade, or the one who has mastered the art of staying young. The dark is entirely wide enough to hold the full, unpolished weight of a changing season. As you lie here, notice if the small micromuscles around the corners of your eyes are still straining against the dark, as if you are still trying to guard your features from the passage of the hours. See if you can allow the collarbones to fall wide and flat, letting the throat widen and the ribs turn soft. Let the breath move into the body with a slow, unhurried ease, as if the air no longer has to pass through a filter of constant physical measurement. There is absolutely nothing you need to preserve in this exact breath. You are safe enough right now to let the heavy wax coatings melt away from the skin, letting your true spirit rest in the quiet sanctuary of the night. A steep path of gravel and pine needles wound past the eastern meditation rooms, descending toward an open library veranda where the golden light of late autumn pooled across the weather-beaten cedar floorboards. In this quiet, elevated workspace, a young scribe named Taku spent his days carrying a heavy, silent friction that restricted the movement of his lungs. Taku was responsible for preserving the monastery's oldest historical records, a duty he approached with a desperate, hyper-vigilant precision. Lately, his focus had been consumed by a painful private realization as he noticed the first gray streaks in his hair and felt a distinct, aching stiffness returning to his knees after the morning sitting. This sudden awareness of his own physical transition threw his mind into a frantic loop of resistance, making him look at every changing line in his face as if it were a direct threat to his competence. He became completely consumed by the fear of decline, believing that if he allowed any form of deterioration to touch his work or his appearance, he would lose his place in the lineage entirely. To combat the damp mountain air that naturally threatened the ancient mulberry paper sheets, Taku had developed a rigid, exhaustive ritual. He spent his nights heating a small bronze melting pot over charcoal, liquefying chunks of sweet, dense mountain beeswax to apply a thick protective glaze over the fragile pages. He believed that by sealing the fibers under a heavy, unchanging shield, he could permanently outsmart the passage of time and keep the records looking exactly as they had in their first season. But every time he applied the hot mixture, his hands would grip the smooth bone scraper with a tight, anxious discipline that crushed the organic grain of the text. The cooled wax turned the pages thick, heavy, and incredibly brittle, making them completely impossible to turn without the fibers cracking beneath the weight of the seal. This constant, desperate effort to freeze the life of the manuscript left a burning, sharp strain behind his brow, robbing him of a single hour of quiet, deep rest. Seeking a way to ease the hot pressure in his head, Taku carried his heavy bronze melting pot out onto the open veranda, where the dry scent of decaying leaves met the rich aroma of heated honeycombs. An elderly calligrapher, an old nun named Sister Yuki, sat quietly on a low woven stool near the railing, her hands slightly trembling as she ground a block of charcoal ink against a wet stone slab. Her face was deeply lined by 80 winters, her skin resembling the beautiful, weathered bark of the ancient pines that grew along the rocky drop below. She did not speak when the young scribe set down his heavy tools, nor did she comment on the rigid posture that held his spine in a constant state of defense. She simply reached out with her slightly unstable hand and placed a flat horn scraper directly on the wooden table. watching the small charcoal fire flicker in the autumn dusk. Taku laid out a fresh sheet of unsealed paper, his throat tightening as he began to voice the heavy panic that filled his midnight hours. He explained his deep dread of the changing seasons, telling the old nun how he endlessly checked his body for signs of decline, fearing the day his eyesight would cloud and his usefulness to the temple would vanish completely. He told her that despite his best efforts to seal the ledger leaves against the moisture, the thick wax panels kept cracking down the center, leaving his chest feeling completely restricted and hollow. Sister Yuki remained perfectly still, listening to the soft, rhythmic scrape of the horn tool against the cedar table as the wind stirred the branches of the forest below. She did not offer a quick phrase of reassurance, nor did she try to argue away his fear. She merely reached over, picked up the bronze pot of boiling hot wax, and poured a heavy pool of the yellow liquid directly over a blank, beautiful page that Taku had just laid out. The young scribe gasped in panic, his knuckles turning white as he reached for the horn tool to frantically smooth the wax before it hardened into a permanent block. Guided by his old habit of absolute control, he held his breath, locked his wrist, and tried to scrape the golden surface into a flat, transparent sheet that would leave the paper looking untouched. But the more he forced the tool against the cooling mixture, the more the heavy wax tore at the delicate mulberry fibers beneath, creating jagged, opaque ridges that permanently ruined the texture of the sheet. He tightened the small muscles along his jawline, leaning closer in the fading light as if his own physical force could compel the fluid material to freeze into a perfect, unchanging frame. The sharp ache behind his eyes grew more intense, and the cords of his neck locked into a stiff, painful brace against the wood. The golden sunlight faded into gray shadows across the veranda floorboards, marked only by the repetitive clicking of the charcoal heater and the deep silence of the surrounding pines. Take's palms grew damp from the internal strain, yet the wax-coated page looked entirely ruined, its heavy surface refusing to look transparent under the desperate pressure of his hands. The frantic urgency to protect the paper from the natural weather was producing the very destruction he was trying to avoid. Sister Yuki stood up from her low stool and walked to the edge of the railing, looking out at the mountain leaves that were falling silently through the autumn air. She did not scold him for his ruined work, nor did she tell him that his technique was lacking the grace of the elders. She gently reached down, placed her cool, weathered fingers over his white knuckles, and guided the horn scraper back onto the wooden table. Yuki looked at the jagged, thick wax ridges and asked the young man why he was trying to turn a living leaf into an immovable stone before the tree had finished its season. Taku replied that he had to save it, that if he allowed the pages to yellow or change in the archive, the transition would mean he had failed his duty, leaving his own existence completely broken. The old nun did not offer a long lecture. Instead, she reached into a low wooden drawer beneath the desk, pulled out a very old manuscript sheet that had never been coated in wax, and laid it flat in the twilight. The paper was deeply yellowed. Its edges were frayed and soft from decades of handling, and the bold black ink characters had faded into a gentle charcoal gray that blended softly into the fiber. Yet the text remained perfectly legible, its weathered lines holding a deep, organic dignity that required no protective seal to carry the truth of the lineage. Yuki took a soft cloth, gently cleared a few dry pine needles from the surface, and let the ancient page breathe in the cool evening wind. The document did not shrink from its yellowed texture, nor did it try to force an artificial brightness onto its history. It simply occupied its true space on the veranda, its raw edges catching the faint starlight, while the deep silence of the forest wrapped around its borders. As the heavy pressure of the tool was dropped, Taku felt the tight contraction along his jaw open slightly, allowing a long, unhurried breath to pass through his torso. The old calligrapher noted that a true record carries the light of the valley, not because it avoids the frost, but because its unsealed paper knows how to turn gold with the season without needing a frame to hold its value. Taku looked down at the frayed, ancient document resting in the cold air, realizing how much energy he had wasted trying to force his own form into a shape that was never meant to be frozen. The sharp, hot tension behind his brow had loosened by a small fraction, Yet as the autumn darkness climbed higher against the veranda pillars, a deeper transition remained completely unlit. The young scribe had laid down the heavy horn scraper, but the urgent longing to protect his container from the clock was still carved like a hidden pattern, deep within his mind. This quiet interaction over the ancient, unsealed manuscript leaf on the cold cedar veranda does not mean you should stop feeling the natural human vulnerability that comes with a changing body. Nor does it ask you to view the passing years with a cold, unfeeling indifference. It is not an invitation to become a detached observer who refuses to value the physical strength, vitality, or beauty of your life, or who steps away from the deep appreciate for presence that makes the heart alive. Buddhist wisdom points toward a completely different kind of interior posture, a soft, heavy honesty that rests underneath the frantic urge to physically freeze the history of your container out of a deep sense of unworthiness. The hot, throbbing tension we carry directly along the length of our jawline is rarely caused by the simple fact that our lives contain real seasons of transition or moments where a physical form changes its texture. Rather, the true exhaustion comes from the hidden blueprint we hold in our thoughts, the rigid belief that says a changing appearance is a structural failure that must be coated in an immovable layer to prove our value. We become deeply attached to our identity as the youth we once were, gripping our constant self-monitoring and our internal comparison routines as if they were the only things preventing our total erasure. This desperate grip turns our natural capacity for self-care into a state of constant, exhausting internal warfare. When we look at this pattern through a gentler light, we begin to see that our distress intensifies when we try to force an emotional terrain that is inherently designed to unfold in its own slow season. A graying hair will leave its natural sign. An unexpected fatigue will bring its own cold gravity, and your mind will occasionally experience a sorrow that cannot be solved by a sharp correction. This is the authentic reality of being human. But when we demand that our physical container remain perfectly symmetrical and unchanging through every turn, we are trying to turn a living, fluid ledger leaf into a rigid box that cannot carry the weight of real life without splitting apart. Every time you strike your own spirit with a heavy phrase of self-criticism, every time you search the mirror for a hidden verdict on your worth, it is as if another thick layer of boiling wax is delivered to the delicate fiber of your structure. The hot glaze smudges the text, producing nothing but dark, opaque ridges that blur your true vision, trapping the damp chill of your real anxiety underneath, and forcing the throat to carry a tight, aching armor through the night. Month after month, year after year, you have been balancing this heavy facade on your brow, wondering why your breathing feels so constricted by midnight, wondering why it feels so difficult to let your lungs expand with a deep, unhurried ease. The core of this insight reveals that the heaviest burden is a secondary layer of friction that we actively build into our own experience. The world may bring us a genuine moment of changing health or a visible shift in our vitality, which arrives like a single yellowed line on the page. That is the natural weight of living. But the mind, in its terror of looking insufficient, immediately reaches for the heavy tools of resistance. We spend the quiet hours of the night mentally replaying our past days of highest energy, calculating how we will fix our appearance tomorrow, trying to outsmart the biological clock, and packing the tension down into a tight, dense knot along the throat. The original pain took up only a small space in the torso, but our internal litigation goes on for hours, creating a heavy, rigid artifact that restricts the very breath in our lungs. Peace does not come from finding a magical valley where no bodies ever age, or where no physical textures ever change. A life completely free of sudden transitions, shifting boundaries, or irregular chapters does not exist anywhere in the human world. True spiritual freedom begins when you stop treating every new line as a sign that you must change your design, allowing the ledger leaf to rest in the center of the veranda, and letting its margin remain unsealed until the morning. You change your relationship with the clock by choosing not to turn it into an immediate emergency project for your anxiety. True awareness is the gentle capacity to step back from the melting pot, to simply notice the heavy search as it forms in your thoughts, without letting your physical posture be driven into a forced position of defense. It means observing that a pattern of over-monitoring has arisen, recognizing its familiar, tight texture, and choosing not to pull its vertical strain down the center of your throat. You see the expectation of perfection, but you do not let it become your cage. You do not turn the temporary necessity of facing an unknown physical future into a permanent state of expressive siege that defines how you must rest. When we look at our own history through this compassionate lens, a deep sense of gentleness begins to open within the bones. This kindness is not a soft excuse for giving up, but a courageous willingness to meet our own self-scrutiny without turning it into a reason to punish ourselves. You begin to understand why you wove the heavy defense in the first place. You see the younger version of yourself who learned that being perfectly unblemished was the only way to protect the stability of your social standing. The one who realized that looking flawless kept you safe in competitive environments. That habit served a purpose once, and it kept you secure in spaces where your raw vulnerabilities felt too dangerous to show. But tonight, as you lie in the quiet safety of this room, you can look at that unbending physical facade with immense tenderness, recognizing that the old shield has become the very weight that locks your body against the bed. Letting go in the true spiritual sense does not mean throwing a bitter coldness into the face of your current body, nor does it mean refusing to offer your best nourishment when the system requires your support. It simply means opening your closed teeth, releasing your desperate grip on an imaginary timeline of youth, and allowing the unsealed paper of your spirit to absorb the dark and the light right where it sits. It is the recognition that you cannot force your form to look perfectly unchanging, no matter how much of your own sleep you sacrifice to hammer the structure in place. When you stop trying to act as the flawless ornament for the entire world, the mind discovers a spacious, uncarved foundation that has been waiting underneath the strain all along. In a short while, this journey will take us deeper into the veranda space, moving past the hot charcoal fire into a place where the blueprint of our defenses begins to fully dissolve. We will see what happens when the scribe stops trying to polish the surface and finally learns to trust the raw texture of the changing leaf. But for right now, let this understanding wash through the physical layers of your torso like a cool, clearing mountain fog. You do not need to smooth the entire framework of your life tonight, and you do not need to calculate how you will present your edges to the world tomorrow. The entire fluid reality of your transitioning form can simply rest across the pillow, unpolished, unsealed, and completely unobserved. Feel the space between your shoulder blades become wide and flat against the linen, letting the small muscles around the neck relax their protective hold. Every time you breathe out, imagine the tightly bound joints of your mind losing just a fraction of their tension. The features do not need to be forced into a display of unchanging youth. They only need to be granted the permission to settle, to soften, and to remain completely unvarnished in the quiet of the night. You are safe enough right now to let the chiseled facade crumble away into the dark, letting your true skin breathe in the quiet of the night. If it feels right, allow your attention to sink quietly into the soft, unhurried space of your physical form, observing the natural movement of the air without any effort to modify its rhythm. There is no need to create a perfect pattern of breathing tonight, nor is there any requirement to change the way your chest expands in this quiet hour. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool sensation as the breath enters the nose, moves past the throat, and expands the ribs with a calm, steady cadence. You might notice the gentle release as the air slips away, taking a small fraction of the day's physical evaluation along with it. In this immediate space, nothing is expected of your alignment, and you are completely permitted to simply be a person supported by the ground. As you rest here, you may notice a specific obligation, an unshared problem, or a worry about the passing numbers of time beginning to rise into your awareness. Perhaps it is a systemic anxiety about your changing vitality, or a hidden tension within your body that you feel you must constantly balance before the morning arrives. Instead of fighting this mental image, or scolding yourself for holding on to the weight, see if you can simply recognize the emotional pattern behind it. You can recognize the familiar urge to fire up the heavy machinery of self-defense, the ancient habit of coating the surface so that the framework around you stays level. Even noticing this tendency is completely enough. There is absolutely no pressure to force a change or to make the worry disappear right now. If it feels comfortable, imagine taking that specific physical burden, that unshared responsibility, or that chronic anxiety about looking weathered, and placing it directly into a small bronze melting pot filled with hot wax. See the dark vessel resting quietly within the landscape of your mind. Picture the dense substance, representing the intense effort you used to try and force a flat surface onto an unpredictable timeline. You are not trying to force it into a smooth finish right now. You are not searching for a new physical alignment, and you are not trying to calculate how you will present your features tomorrow. You might simply visualize the heavy, rigid weight over your jaw and temples slowly opening its tight connections, allowing the hardened glaze to gently drop away under a slow wave of somatic relaxation. As the tension is released, look at how the internal imagery begins to transform entirely on its own. Without any forceful action from your side, the rigid lines roll back into their natural unsealed ease. The sharp boundaries and tight alignments slide off the skin, leaving the face completely wide, open, and unburdened. The small muscles around the eyes stop fighting the dark, shifting softly until they rest flat against the bone, distributing their weight evenly across the soft fabric below. The heat in your temples loses its grip as the artificial architecture simply settles down into the stability of the earth. Let your awareness return gently to the physical presence of the bed, feeling the entire length of the spine sinking down into the soft support beneath it. The muscles running down the hinge of the jaw can completely surrender their vertical strain. The space between your eyebrows can remain wide, relaxed, and entirely unvarnished by the demands of the upcoming week. You can return to this simple sensation whenever you are ready, knowing that the internal sculptor has left the wheel for the night. There is no vessel to reinforce before the dawn, and nothing needs to be painted into an immovable state. The future can remain completely unaligned, porous, quiet, and perfectly still in the dark. Every quiet, effortless wave of your breath allows the core of your alignment to settle completely into the solid foundation of the mattress below. You can feel the vastness of this unadorned space expanding within your physical frame, creating a silent refuge where no external evaluation can reach you. No decorative performance is required, and no internal overseer is drafting the script for tomorrow's interactions. The old, exhaustive demand to project absolute tranquility for the comfort of others has fully burned itself out in the dark, leaving only the soft, uncarved reality of a human form supported entirely by the earth. True tranquility is discovered the exact second we stop demanding that our internal landscape look perfectly smooth before we give our bones permission to sink into the linen. The mind finds its genuine home not by fixing the fractures of the day, but by realizing that the raw ledger leaf is completely whole right now, just as it sits in the deep shadows of the room. Let your consciousness float down into the lower abdomen, where the breath moves like water, filling a deep, dark well. There is no need to count the cycles or to measure the depth of the expansion. You can simply allow the physical frame to occupy its true volume, without trying to tuck the stomach in or hold the ribs in a state of rigid readiness. You are completely off duty for the remaining hours of the night. The stories of your inadequacy, the lists of your undone tasks, and the images of your past days that seem to be moving faster can all sit quietly in the cool dampness of the veranda floor. They do not possess the power to pull you out of this bed unless you pick up the scraper to work them. Let the iron tools remain dark and still on the wooden bench, while your entire being settles into the vast, protective density of the uncarved earth. The deep chill of early winter began to turn the mountain paths slick, sending long gray streaks of frost down into the lower cedar groves surrounding the library. Taku spent the following weeks working near the northern veranda, his breath still catching slightly whenever the elder masters arrived to inspect the seasonal archives. Though he had stopped heating his bronze melting pot every night, his jawline still carried a protective stiffness whenever he watched the other scribes gather around the central charcoal brazier to discuss their progress. On this particular evening, The monastery was preparing for the arrival of a major winter storm, a season when the heavy mountain snow would put the entire unsealed veranda under immense, dangerous atmospheric pressure. Taku had spent 3 solid days organizing a massive, rare manuscript, believing that keeping this ancient ledger completely free of dust would finally prove to the entire library that he was no longer lagging behind the standards of the elders. Beside the low archway of the storage cellar, Sister Yuki stood silently in the damp air, her heavy arms crossed over her linen habit, listening to the high wind scream through the tops of the mountain pines. The atmosphere was thick with the clean, sharp smell of dried mulberry bark, heated charcoal, and the bitter scent of scorched cedar needles from the nearby stove. Taku stepped onto the wet floorboards carrying his work, his chest automatically tightening, as he prepared to place the document into the critical center display gap. Suddenly, the unstable shutters above the desk gave way under the weight of the wind. A heavy cascade of loose frost and wet rain slammed directly into the work table, striking the ancient paper ledger and creating a deep, irregular watermark right across its center axis, causing the faded charcoal ink to bleed into 2 blurred fragments. 3 days of intense secret perfectionism were instantly reduced to a heap of damp, unusable sheets. The scribe's torso immediately locked into an intense, burning posture of total humiliation. His fingers clamped onto the edges of the desk. His eyes widened in panic, and a wave of raw inadequacy flooded his throat as he realized the elders would see the ledger left damaged before the storm arrived. The internal litigation in his mind began to scream that this accident was absolute proof of his incompetence, that he was fundamentally unready for the mature tasks of the monastery, and that he should drop his tools and leave the valley entirely before the dawn exposed his failure. He wanted to scream at the rain, to curse the wind, and to treat the sudden stain as a permanent verdict on his worth as an archivist. But in that exact moment of rising flight, Taku stopped his hands. He did not attempt to frantically dry the wet paper over the fire, and he did not voice a loud defense to protect his reputation from the passing monks. He simply sat down directly on the cold cedar floorboards, right beside the large, unpolished piece of storage wood that rested near the toolbox. He closed his eyes and took one slow, deliberate breath, letting the thin, cold air expand the very center of his chest, allowing the heavy ache behind his breastbone to simply exist without any immediate correction. He did not try to pretend the loss had not occurred, and he did not try to force an artificial sense of Zen calm over his panic. He chose to sit directly with the raw, uncarved uncertainty of the ruined page, stopping the old habit of treating his frantic thoughts as the absolute truth. He opened his eyes and looked at the irregular watermark. Instead of running away from the mess, he reached down with an open, relaxed hand and began to clear the wet ice off the desk, his movements carrying a low, calm precision that required no audience. As he cleared the table, he noticed a young novice from the lower valley who had been assigned to help haul the wood bundles, standing shivering in the corner of the wet veranda, his hands bleeding from the sharp frozen twigs and looking entirely forgotten by the frantic crew above. Without a single word of explanation or self-pity, Taku walked to the wooden toolbox, picked up his own soft wool cloths that he used to clean the ancient inkstones, and bound them gently around the bleeding fingers of the young novice. He did not wait for an expression of gratitude, nor did he look up to see if Sister Yuki was observing his charity. He simply offered the protection out of a quiet, unchipped presence that required no external validation to feel adequate. The young novice looked down at his bound hands, his posture softening as the heavy wool shielded his skin from the sharp frost. He looked up at Taku with an unembellished nod of recognition, a simple exchange that carried no social glaze but held a deep, unpolished reality. The raw manuscript wall remained damp. The perfect layout was completely ruined, yet the space between the two men was entirely full, resting quietly in the shadows without needing a single smooth surface to prove its worth. Sister Yuki stepped forward from the dark archway, looking at the damp paper and the heavy wooden chest that lay unchipped in the twilight. The old woman remarked that a record does not fail, because a single sheet changes its color before the season is dry. The mountain is already wide enough to carry the weight of the storm, and your nature has never been a shattered fragment waiting for a permanent seal to give it dignity. True transformation does not mean you preserve a page that can never be altered by the earth. It means you discover that your own unshaped weight is a sacred footing that needs no perfect finish to carry the haul. Taku looked out over the vast, dark field of the forest floor, realizing how many years he had spent treating his own heart as a damaged tablet that had to be continuously ground down to escape the shame of being unready. The quiet, heavy ache behind his breastbone was still a soft sensation, and his old fear of being exposed remained a distant murmur in his awareness. But as he stood up on the damp gravel beside the master calligrapher, letting his hands hang loosely at his sides, he carried himself with one small, enduring shift. He would continue to clear the shelves for the monastery library, but he would let the pages remain irregular whenever the mountain chose the raw shape, trusting the self-contained gravity of his own spirit, rather than the artificial measurements of the world. This internal shift beside the wet manuscript layout illuminates the precise mental machinery that keeps your nervous system awake tonight. When we look deeply into the root of this continuous exhaustion, we discover that the depletion rarely comes from the actual presence of a changing season or the physical reality of a shifting form. The true weight accumulates in the continuous, hidden labor of simulation that we run behind the scenes of our eyes. We spend our lives running a frantic internal workshop, constantly hammering at our own history and scanning the environment for any sign of disapproval, driven by a deep fear that if we ever relax our guard, our presence will be judged as completely inadequate. This chronic demand for structural perfection becomes a heavy taxation we levy against our own body, forcing us to continuously rehearse tomorrow's encounters, rewrite yesterday's perceived failures, and cross-examine our current progress as if we were standing before a cold, critical assembly of judges. We even try to repair our own natural sense of unreadiness by using the harsh instrument of self-blame. We judge our minds for feeling anxious, we scold our throat for holding a heavy constriction, and we slowly turn our very imperfections into a permanent description of who we are. We begin to view ourselves not as a tired human being who is doing their best to navigate a difficult mountain trail, but as a fundamentally fractured paper ledger that must be constantly reshaped to have any right to carry the haul. This constant internal forcing creates a deep, chronic strain that settles directly behind the breastbone and locks the muscles of the jaw into a narrow, restricted alignment. Ancient insights remind us that there is a profound distinction between the unavoidable cold raindrops of life and the secondary layers of burden we actively build onto the moment. Think of the unexpected transition or the unreturned investment of care that life brings as a single unsealed ledger leaf lying on the table of the veranda floor. An abrupt change in your personal path, a visible shift in your vitality, or a quiet wave of natural sorrow is simply that weathered parchment. It rests there, and it naturally carries its own plain weight. That is the primary friction of living in a world shared with other human beings. But the mind, in its terror of looking insufficient, immediately reaches for the heavy tools of resistance. We begin to strike the page in our thoughts, trying to apply 1,000 explanations, demanding that the open margin instantly flatten itself out, and filling the entire floor of our awareness with sharp, chaotic splinters of panic. The original event took up only a small space in reality, but our internal litigation goes on for hours, creating a heavy, rigid weight that restricts the very breath in our lungs. Peace does not come from finding a magical valley where no page is ever yellow, or where no biological clocks ever move. A life completely free of sudden changes, shifting boundaries, or irregular chapters does not exist anywhere in the human world. True spiritual freedom begins when you stop treating every new line as a sign that you must change your design, allowing the document to rest in the center of the vault, and letting its margin remain unsealed until the morning. You change your relationship with the clock by choosing not to turn it into an immediate emergency project for your anxiety. When you rest with this understanding in the quiet hours of the night, you realize that you do not need to secure the approval of the entire universe to earn the right to relax your muscles. The chronic scanning you feel is not a failure of character. It is simply an old, well-worn path that your body takes when it feels completely unprotected. You can look at the impulse to overexert. You can feel the heavy collapse right behind the breastbone. And you can surround that whole hypervigilant pattern with an immense quiet tenderness. Instead of using shame to force your feelings into a state of artificial readiness, you can simply observe the open framework of your worries without letting your fingers hold the scraper. This is the precise moment where the center of the chest begins to settle into a much deeper layer of reality. You start to see that the preservation you have been trying to secure is completely unnecessary for your structure to exist. And the uncertainty around you is not a threat, but a vast capacity that naturally knows how to hold whatever changes arrive. The upcoming weeks are not a fragile path waiting to crush you. They are simply an interconnected landscape that will reveal its own texture one step at a time, completely independent of how much sleep you sacrifice to scan it tonight. You can allow your presence to remain completely unshaped, without needing to wear its hypothetical smoothness as your current armor. Let this realization settle into the deep spaces between your shoulder blades, letting the physical upper back turn wide and flat against the mattress. You are not required to smooth every relationship or to resolve the alignment of the next year before you are allowed to rest. The tools can be left on the wooden bench. The heavy horn scrapers can remain dark, and the entire framework of your life can remain completely loose, unsealed, and free from the burden of absolute protection. Now let this ancient archive insight travel all the way down into the very specific texture of your modern afternoon. The unsealed ledger leaf we carry does not exist in an abstract mountain rock chamber. It functions inside the small, mundane transactions of our everyday routines. You can see it in the way you hold your digital interface in the palm of your hand, staring at a blank screen while waiting for a text message that has not arrived yet. Every minute of silence from the other person feels like a shifting line in your story that you must immediately control. Trying to outsmart the biological clock, wondering if your own shifting presence has caused an unfixable flaw in their opinion of you, and drawing a complex map of decline out of a brief delay. You might notice it when you feel an intense pressure to smile and offer an agreeable comment during a meeting, even though your chest is tied in a narrow contraction, choosing to wear a mask of unchanging youth because showing your true fatigue feels far too dangerous. We carry this heavy cosmetic labor into our most intimate relationships, constantly checking the emotional temperature of the house, trying to balance the scales of everyone else's comfort while our own internal reservoir runs completely dry. You feel the weight of this labor when you lie awake at midnight, replaying a minor physical slip from 3 days ago, treating a single sign of changing energy as if it were a catastrophic flaw that requires a lifetime of mental grinding to smooth away. We look at the lives of others through a glowing glass screen, comparing our raw internal terrain to their polished exterior, instantly concluding that we have fallen behind, that we are missing the mark, and that we must work twice as hard to draw a version of ourselves that matches an ideal structure. Even when the body demands a moment of deep stillness, a subtle wave of guilt surfaces within the heart, whispering that rest is a luxury you have not yet earned, forcing you to treat an hour of quiet recovery as if it were a structural defect in your presentation. Living this way turns every single day into an exhausting act of performance, but the practice of inner freedom is built in the tiny gaps between the world's demands and your internal reaction. It begins when you experience a sudden surge of panic during a difficult conversation, and instead of immediately offering an easy, pleasing lie to diffuse the tension, you choose to take one slow, grounded breath before you speak. You do not have to orchestrate a perfect response, and you do not have to fix their discomfort. You simply allow the moment to be slightly heavy, standing still like the unsealed parchment in the windless veranda space, remaining open in the frost without needing to apply a single layer of wax right that second. This modern application means realizing that the frantic thoughts circulating through your mind are merely old, automated patterns, not absolute commands that you must obey. When the internal voice tells you that you are fundamentally insufficient, or that you must stay awake to solve the riddle of tomorrow, you can look at that thought with an immense, quiet curiosity. You can recognize it as a coarse wax ridge, a familiar piece of old material, without allowing the horn scraper to trace it through your features. You learn to care for the human beings around you with an open, relaxed palm, rather than a desperate, white-knuckle grip. You can offer kindness without sacrificing your own boundaries, understanding that true love does not require you to turn your own spirit into a flat background for others to paint on. As the night deepens, you are completely allowed to drop the horn tool right where it sits. You do not need to achieve a flawless state of self-improvement before you have permission to close your eyes. The unread messages, the incomplete projects, and the shifting moods of the world can remain completely suspended in the dark, without your mind needing to touch them again until the morning. Rest is not a reward that you must buy with a day of perfect compliance. It is your basic, unalienable nature, a vast space that has been waiting for you to simply step out of the workspace. Let the entire day go slack, allowing the cords to fall loosely to the earth as we prepare to drift into the deepest stillness of the night. The dark hour has fully settled over the deep mountain veranda, and the quietness of the windless pine forest is gathering into the space around you. The burning friction of the internal preservation workshop has dissolved into complete stillness, leaving only the cool, unmoving foundation of the cedar floorboards. The horn scraper, the heavy bronze melting pot, and the charcoal heater have all been laid down on the low working bench of the mind. Every single expression you perform today, every physical evaluation you calculated, and every future decline you tried to outsmart can simply remain unsealed and motionless in the dark. Your chest is sinking deeper into the support below with every slow, quiet breath, becoming completely grounded, heavy, and still. The muscles along the hinge of the jaw are widening, softening, and losing their rigid presentation, expanding like the wide, unvarnished veranda pillars that rest effortlessly under the cold winter sky. The eyes are completely relaxed, releasing the final, lingering strain of looking out for the preservation of the surface. The breath moves into the body with a slow, feather-light softness, requiring absolutely no decoration, no forced warmth, and no filter of explanation from your side. You are returning to an original state of unsealed paper, a spacious sanctuary that exists long before the permanent wax panels were ever heated. The heavy mask of unchanging youth you wove around your awareness is slipping away from the skin, dropping into the cool dark like a dry cedar needle that has finally outlived its season. You are entirely safe enough in this dark room to stop pairing the universe, allowing the unread markers, the incomplete projects, and the shifting textures of tomorrow to rest exactly as they are. Nothing needs to be coated, nothing needs to be prearranged, and nothing needs to be made permanent before you allow your consciousness to sink into sleep. Imagine a single, unwritten mulberry leaf resting quietly inside a dark wooden drawer, on a low shelf in a completely closed archive room. The delicate paper does not trace the movement of the winter frost. It does not anticipate the temperature of the next morning breeze, and it does not judge its own raw, irregular edges. It simply rests, becoming heavier and more secure in the dark cedar box with every passing minute, entirely protected from the winds that move far above its grain. Let your own internal awareness become just like that resting document, heavy, porous, and deeply anchored in the quiet floor of the world. The whole timeline of your personal history is completely still, and the internal scribe that documented your presentation has left the desk to receive the night. You are permitted to let the features go completely blank, drifting down into the weightless, vast dark where no pages are frozen. If the unsealed texture of the ancient paper is already wide enough to turn gold with the seasons without cracking under the frost, what modern glaze could ever add to the absolute completeness of your own quiet rest? The absolute completeness of your own quiet rest requires no validation from the passage of the hours, because the true nature of your spirit has always been a self-contained sanctuary that remains entirely whole, precisely as it sits in the dark. As you lie here in the deep, windless stillness of the winter night, this same unadorned refuge begins to expand within the very center of your chest. The small, frantic workshop that spent the daytime hours trying to force a bright, decorative finish over your changing features has cooled down into complete darkness. The heavy smoke of emotional performance has entirely cleared from the rafters of your awareness, leaving only a wide, open vault where your breath can move without a single filter of external compliance. You do not need to construct a flawless narrative to protect your place on this earth. The world is entirely capable of carrying your raw fatigue, your unvoiced longing, and your quiet weight without asking you to seal a single false conclusion. Every slow, rhythmic inhalation is a gentle invitation to return to the simplicity of your unaltered presence, reminding you that your true value exists long before you ever try to win the final race against the clock. When we rest deeply in this spacious clarity, we begin to discover the profound peace of what the ancient calligraphers call the unprinted self. This is the part of your awareness that remains completely untouched by the changing expectations of the environment, standing steady like the cold, dense cedar veranda beneath the mountain peak. The timber does not strain itself to look unweathered when the winter mist rolls through the ridge, nor does it judge its own matte texture for becoming silver and dark. It simply allows the mountain air to touch its grain, holding its density without a single ounce of internal friction or self-condemnation. The changing levels of your physical energy, the moments where you were left mourning a past season of high performance, and the unwritten paths of your upcoming weeks are merely brief shadows passing over the surface of the wood. They do not alter the fundamental safety of your structure, and they do not require you to wear out your own spirit trying to manufacture a hot glaze to change them. You can allow the attention of others to shift like the wind. You can allow the day to settle with all its rough, unfinished margins, and you can allow your own face to drop into an immense, unobserved blankness in the middle of the quiet night. Let the absolute weight of this deep stillness spread through the small muscles of your cheeks, allowing the jaw joints to unlatch completely until the teeth separate and the lips turn soft. The skin across the forehead is perfectly smooth and cool, completely released from the warm, gripping tension that comes from mentally reading the mirror or calculating the vitality of tomorrow. You do not have to perform the role of the invulnerable anchor, the unchanging facade, or the stabilizer tonight. The mattress beneath you requires no polished presentation, no forced strength, and no decorative gestures to hold you secure in the dark. It simply absorbs the full, unvarnished depth of your exhaustion with an unconditional, vast stability. The unresolved dynamics of your modern life, the unanswered text threads on your device, and the expectations you feel you must meet can sit quietly on the low working bench, completely frozen and still, while your consciousness drifts further and further away into the dark, restorative waters of absolute slumber. Picture a single drop of mountain dew sliding slowly off a sharp pine needle, falling silently into a shallow stone basin hidden within the archive courtyard. The drop touches the surface, creates a few brief circular ripples, and then completely blends into the quiet, cool body of the water, leaving the surface perfectly flat once again. The basin does not struggle against the ripple. It does not try to freeze the movement to maintain an artificial brightness, and it does not worry about the next drop that might fall from the canopy. It simply remains still, porous, and completely quiet, absorbing the ambient shadows and the deep silence of the ridge into its endless center. Let your own internal awareness become just like that quiet basin of water, so spacious and steady that every passing physical anxiety or lingering regret can simply dissolve into your vast internal quietude without leaving a single fracture behind. You are completely permitted to lay down the horn scraper, to extinguish the furnace of your performance, and to allow the current of the night to carry you into the deepest, most restorative rest. The weight of the skull is fully met by the pillow. The throat is wide and free to expand with the slow, quiet tide of the breath, and the entire modern world has receded into a distant, harmless murmur. There is absolutely nothing left for you to illuminate, nothing left for you to calculate, and no wax structures left for you to hold up through the dark. You have returned to the quiet home that has been waiting underneath the performance machinery all along. A space where the paper is perfectly cool, the table is completely still, and the heart is finally free to sleep. The vast dark carries the mind further into this untroubled valley, where the boundary between the quiet body and the quiet room begins to soften and fade away entirely. Every small breath is a gentle wave that washes over the old, tired habits of the day, smoothing out the internal pathways like water, moving over smooth riverstone. You can feel the immense relaxation spreading down through the lower back, the thighs, the calves, and into the soles of the feet, leaving the entire physical frame completely weightless and loose. The persistent voice that insisted you must always be hypervigilant, always ready to balance the scales of the world, has grown completely faint, like a distant temple bell echoing once across the misty ridges before falling silent. You do not need to keep watch over the horizon tonight. The world is capable of turning on its axis without your constant protection, and the seasons are held in their own paths, completely free of your need to weave their comfort for them. This brings a profound realization of what it truly means to exist without defense. In the ancient understanding of the mind, we learn that our true nature is not a fragile thing that needs to be constantly hidden behind a wall of compliance or structural force. The true self is like the deep space of the night itself, completely uninjured by the storms that pass through it, completely untouched by the years that were spoken or left unsealed. When you stop treating every difficult transition as a personal failure that must be immediately corrected with a hot clamp, you allow the mind to return to its natural state of weightless clarity. The heavy wax pack has lost all its grip, unspooling its cords into long, relaxed lines that simply rest on the clean earth. You are finally allowed to step completely out of the workshop, leaving the tools of self-protection behind, and walking out into the wide, open air where nothing is demanded of your spirit. Let the absolute peace of this moment sink into the deep center of your chest, allowing the lungs to expand with a slow, effortless freedom that requires no justification. The room around you is perfectly still, the cool air carrying the faint, clean scent of damp cedar and mountain rain into the quiet spaces of the house. You are completely permitted to let go of the need to be the strong one, the unchanging one, or the one who fixes the fractures of the day. The bed beneath you is entirely willing to carry the full, unvarnished depth of your exhaustion, absorbing the weight of the limbs and the quiet surrender of the mind, without asking for anything in return. The unfinished business of your life, the moments you wish had gone differently, and the endless lists for tomorrow can sit quietly in the dark, completely frozen and still, while you drift further and further away into the deep waters of rest. Picture a single candle flame burning brightly inside a small, sturdy stone lantern high on a windswept mountain ridge. The wind may howl through the pines, and the fog may press against the thick glass, but the flame itself remains perfectly steady, casting a soft, warm glow over the smooth river stones below. It does not fight the wind. It does not try to illuminate the entire valley, and it does not worry about how long the night will last. It simply burns with a quiet, unbothered constancy, resting completely in its own warmth. Let your own internal awareness become just like that steady, protected flame, entirely safe within the sanctuary of your own body, completely undisturbed by the external weather of the world. You have woven your last defense for the day. You have dropped the wooden tool, and the entire fabric of your life is completely loose, spacious, and free. Let the mind let go of its final hold on the world, dropping down into the deep, dark, restorative silence of absolute slumber, where the heart is entirely at home, the timber framework is perfectly quiet, and the spirit is finally free to sleep.